Hi, I'm Robert Pinsky. I want to welcome you to the Robert Lowell Memorial Lecture. It is subtitled In the Spirit of Room 202, and I'll try to say 3 sentences or 4 sentences to you about Room 202. BU is very proud that in the room that we still use to conduct the poetry and fiction writing workshops, Room 202 at 236 Bay State Road, the poet Robert Lowell taught a class in which the students included Sylvia Plath, George Starbuck, and Anne Sexton. And when, in memory of the Shenson family, Fred Levin and Nancy Livingston Levin gave us the money to have a good reading series here, we decided it would be in the spirit of that class in which officially it was a teacher and some students, but in the spirit of art, it was writers talking about their art together. So the way we have set this up, and have done it in the past with visitors like Philip Levine and Ivan Boland, C.K. Williams, we have a very brief reading by a recent graduate of the program representing students. There's a faculty member who reads representing the faculty. And after those brief readings, we have the full-scale reading by our visitor, this time Grace Paley, who brings together fiction and poetry. That is what's going to happen. I'm very proud of the recent student reader, Samantha Mineo Myers. As you will see in a few minutes, she's terrifically talented and is also a good reader, and I promise you that you will have a good time tonight. It's also my job to say that, with the exception of Leslie Epstein, you have to turn off your cell phones now. Thank you very much. Here is Samantha Myers.
Thank you. And thanks so much for coming. I'm going to read 4 short, I promise, poems. The first one is going to be a poem about spring. I'm hoping that maybe if I read it, it will come. This is called Viburnum. A viburnum is a flowering bush. That's all I've got. Okay. Viburnum. In bloom, the balls of flowers resurrect evening in Paris from Bergdorf's crystal vials or 5-and-dime glass fogged thickly through the sliders. My mother wears joy with its jasmines and May roses, created, it was said, for cheer in the Depression. Once, a bit of the stopper slid down the neck of her bottle, trapped until tapped through with a scissor like a fumbled cork. Her lipstick tube, dull gold with scrollwork at the swivel, empty, I held onto it for years. In May, the viburnum bush drops its fruit into the ivy. Spring is for divesting, but I never could, even mourning what I did not know, but miss, automats, telegrams, the red farmhouse my parents owned, red as the Japanese maple they took with them when they moved. Unpruned, it overtakes the backyard canopy, makes the old growth seem strange. I lived, for a while, across the street from the Stanetsky Funeral Home in Brookline, which you probably drive past every day, maybe, but living across from it is definitely an experience. You used to see the daily comings and goings there. So this poem is called Living Across the Street from the Funeral Home. Acceptable in daylight. Men in hats pass orange tags and parking advice. Business is daily, is business. False windows mean time deprivation, purgatory. Rumor. The parlor ceiling is a Sistine burlesque. By night, the unmentionable thump of offloading coffins, unmarked chemical deliveries, making possible the even ignorance of daytime, how our November campsite woke to a ring of bear tracks, large as plates. I've been a vegetarian for 12 years, and I've managed to only write 1 poem about it. Here it is. It's called After Giving Up Meat. After giving up meat, encounters with animals became more dramatic. White moths circled my bed lamp. Fearless mice grazed in the candy dish. Divining mercy, one thin fox groomed his coat in the driveway, and a mother turkey policed her pups from the stoop. It wasn't their faith I wanted, or even their forgiveness. Their existence was enough, and even that I was content to imagine. Dogs strained their leashes as if I were St. Francis himself. A goshawk buzzed my windshield like a cuff on the arm. Howdy. The nibbling buck raised his forest of antlers in greeting, and I knew my distaste. I was certain their mouths would open and speak. I feared their confidences. This last poem I'll read comes from actually a road trip I took with another graduate student from my year, and I do recommend that for you graduate students if you get the chance. It's a great way to cap off your year here. It's called, so we took this road trip through rural New Mexico, and this poem is called Scenic Route. I found it strange to photograph Chimayo's painted grave sites, stopped parades of glass-eyed dolls, persistent silken blooms in pall from unrelenting sun. The plots, not flat, but mounds, impedimenta stuck with pinwheels, flashing codes, urgent missives from the mist. To call it art implies intention, propaganda bent on finding viewers to convince. In death are flashbulbs, prisms. At home, the driveway pebbles turned through rain and oxidation, my pickup's rusty blue. The bedroom floor, a pamphleteer in hues. The Zuni prayer mat's village street with roofs of modest brownish pink. The oriental rug with stems that curve like boulevards. Outside, the dark promotes the stars. What we author makes no claim on homage. Our devices crack against nature's artless weight. Thank you. Thank you. It is also my honor tonight to introduce Robert Pinsky, former poet laureate and professor of English here at BU. Robert once told me that all working writers need to do two things. They need to earn their bread and write their poems. And for a writer, earning one's bread usually means teaching, and many writers see teaching as just that, a paycheck. But Robert, despite his advice, is not one of those people. Robert's role in the classroom goes far beyond just helping his students grow as poets. In the summer, you can find him helping incoming graduate students get apartments and roommates, and during the year he's constantly providing and pointing out opportunities. And around February, he begins to nudge his group of students about what they might want to do after the year-long program is over. Robert is the kind of teacher who wants to know what his students want to be when they grow up, and more, he wants to help them get there. All the while, his steady, sensible suggestions about each student's writing have begun to sink in. Room 202 is special because of its history, but also because of the vibrant, creative atmosphere that continues there, and Robert Pinsky is at its heart. His new book, Gulf Music, comes out this fall. Please welcome Robert Pinsky.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you all. I will read one poem. It is the first poem. It's a couple of pages. It is the first poem. It is the first poem in the book that Sam mentioned that comes out in the fall. And I'll say a little about the idea of the poem. The poem is called Poem of Disconnected Parts. I hope it is not unconnected parts. The poem tries to be true to what I feel when I read the newspaper. As the grandson of immigrants, I was raised to be a patriotic American. I think I am a patriotic American. Often it is difficult to maintain one's patriotism when one feels deeply critical, indeed anguished, by things that the country does. I don't feel as though I am an articulate expert in defining these political questions. So in this book generally, and in this poem in particular, I try to evoke not only the things that disturb me politically, but to talk about that feeling, or to evoke that feeling of not being particularly a sage, or feeling that because I am a poet, I know more than you about these things. On the contrary, I feel both convinced and angry, and also confused and inarticulate. The parts are disconnected. opinionish moment. That was a literary allusion. Poem of disconnected parts. Maybe I'll add that formally it's a series of couplets that are closed. Poem of disconnected parts. At Robben Island, the political prisoners studied. They coined the motto, each one teach one. In Argentina, the torturers demanded the prisoners address them always as profesor. Many of my friends are moved by guilt, but I am a creature of shame, I am ashamed to say. Culture the lock, culture the key. Imagination that calls the boiled sheepheads in the market smileys. The first year at Guantanamo, Abdul Rahim Dost incised his Pashto poems into styrofoam cups. Quote, the Sangoma says, in our Zulu culture, we do not worship our ancestors. We consult them. End quote. Becky is abandoned in 1902, and Rose dies giving birth in 1924, and Sylvia falls in 1951. Still falling, still dying, still abandoned in 2006, still nothing finished among the descendants. I support the war, says the comic. It's just the troops I'm against. Can't stand those young people. Proud of the fallen, proud of her son, the bomber, ashamed of the government, skeptical. After the Klansman was found not guilty, one juror said she just couldn't vote to convict a pastor. Who do you write for? I write for dead people, for Emily Dickinson, for my grandfather. Quote, the ancestors say the problem with your knees began in your feet. It could move up your back. End quote. But later, the Americans gave Dost not only paper and pen, but books. Hemingway, Dickens. Old Aegyptius said, whoever has called this assembly for whatever reason, that is a good in itself. O thirsty shades who regard the offering, O stained earth, there are many fake Sangomos. This one is real. Colored prisoners got different meals and could wear long pants and underwear. Blacks got only shorts. No, he says, he cannot regret the 3 years in prison. Otherwise, he would not have written those poems. I have a small-town mind, like the Greeks and Trojans. Shame, pride, importance of looking bad or good. Did he see anything like the prisoner on a leash? Yes, in Afghanistan. In Guantanamo, he was isolated. Our enemies disassemble, says the president. Not that anyone at all couldn't misspeak. The profesores created nicknames for torture devices. The airplane, the frog, burping the baby. Not that those who behead the helpless in the name of God or tradition don't also write poetry. Guilts, metaphors, traditions, hunger strikes, culture the penalty, culture the escape. What could your children boast about you? What will your father say down among the shades? The Sangomo told Marvin, quote, you are crushed by some weight. Only your own ancestors can help you. Thank you. It's now my happy job to introduce the main reader, Grace Paley. When writers talk about great writers, a common topic is what sons of bitches they tend to be. Very often you think about all the cruel people and some of the greatest modernist heroes. T.S. Eliot, the anti-Semitic reactionary, and Ezra Pound, the fascist, and people's terrible personal behaviors. And I have a personal frame that comes up when you start thinking about biographies. Every so often you say, or someone feels like saying, thank God for Chekhov. Because Anton Chekhov was a wonderful person, good to other people, a medical doctor who gave some of his life to going to Sakhalin, the penal island, where he cared for the prisoners and wrote and investigated conditions there. Everybody who introduces Grace Paley has to make this pun. Among the most graceful and penetrating writers of my lifetime that I have read is Grace Paley, who's just as though she was born to write sentences and paragraphs. And the brilliance and comedy and concision of her writing are deeply related to the fact that she's someone with a great spirit that people are attracted to, that people like, and that she has been a passionate political defender of human rights, feminism, worked against racism and different kinds of oppression all her life. And far from being preachy, these are all part of a self-mocking, comic, generous spirit. And in books like The Little Disturbances of Man and Enormous Changes at the Last Minute, that soul, as in the stories of Chekhov, generates a literary form that is attractive in just the ways that the soul is attractive. Grace is particularly appropriate for this series, particularly appropriate as the first person, I think, who does write fiction, in that she does write fiction and poetry. It is a complete pleasure and honor to introduce Grace Paley.
Thank you. Thanks, Robert. Nice to hear yourself talked about, you know. But then they stop talking about you. That's it, just when you're getting interested. I'm going to read some poems and some stories. And, well... I'm going to try to make them relate to each other in some way. At least I plan to do that, although it may not work that way. These are a couple of little stories, and I began to write a lot of poetry in two periods of my life, like when I was 15 and then when I was 35. And in between that time, I wrote a lot of stories. But for some reason, I didn't quite stop writing poems when I was writing stories, but that was not what I did with what happened to my head all the time. You know, something would come along and it would really be a story. And then all of a sudden, one day in my late 30s or something would come along and it would be a poem. So that's the way it is, you know. It's kind of interesting. Hi. I usually try to take some kind of a commonality in the stuff that I'm reading. And I've been thinking about my aunt for a long time. My aunt, the first story I read will be hers, and some of the poems too will be for her. I lived with her and with my grandmother and my mother and father, so I lived their lives, and none of them got along with each other, and that was really very good for me because I was going to be a writer, you know. It was very useful, and I tried to make them get along, but I realized that, you know, I couldn't do that, and it was just as well. But anyway, in this country, but in another language, my aunt refuses to marry the men everyone wants her to. My grandmother sat in her chair. She said, "When I lie down at night, I can't rest. My bones push each other. When I wake up in the morning, I say to myself, 'What? Did I sleep? My God, I'm still here. I'll be in this world forever.' My aunt was making the bed. 'Look,' she said to me, 'your grandmother, she doesn't sweat. Nothing has to be washed. Her stockings, her underwear, the sheets. From this, you wouldn't believe what a life she had.' It wasn't life, it was torture. 'Doesn't she love us?' I asked. 'Love you,' my aunt said. 'What else is worth it? You children, your cousin in Connecticut.' 'So, doesn't that make her happy?' My aunt said, 'Ugh, what she saw.' 'What?' I asked. 'What did she see?' 'Someday I'll tell you. One thing I tell you right now, don't carry the main flag. When you're bigger, you'll be in a demonstration or a strike or something. Let go of us. It doesn't have to be you. Let it be someone else.' 'Because Russia carried the main flag, that's why?' I asked. 'Yes, because he was a wonderful boy, only 17, and all by herself. Your grandmother picked him up from the street. He was dead, and she took him home in the wagon.' 'What else?' I asked. My father walked into the room. He said, 'At least your grandmother lived.' 'Didn't you live too?' I asked my aunt. Then my grandmother took her hand. 'Sonia, one reason I don't close my eyes at night, I think about you. You know it. What will be? You have no life.' 'Grandmother,' I asked, 'what about us?' My aunt sighed. 'Little girl, darling, let's take a nice walk.' At the supper table, nobody spoke, so I asked her once more, 'Sonia, tell me, no or yes, do you have a life?' 'Ha,' she said, 'if you really want to know, read Dostoevsky.' Then they all laughed and laughed. My mother brought tea and preserves. My grandmother said to all our faces, 'Why do you laugh? Why?' But my aunt said, 'Laugh.' I'm sorry my voice is a little bit off. Usually it's really very nice. This one is very much like this last one, but it's about my mother. One day I was listening to the AM radio. I heard a song. Oh, I longed to see my mother in the doorway. By God, I said, I understand that song. I have often longed to see my mother in the doorway. As a matter of fact, she did stand frequently in various doorways looking at me. She stood one day just so, at the front door, the darkness of the hallway behind her. It was New Year's Day. She said sadly, "If you come home at 4 a.m. when you're 17, what time will you come home when you're 20? She asked this question without humor or meanness. She had begun her worried preparations for death. She would not be present, she knew, when I was 20, so she wondered. Another time she stood in the doorway of my room. I had just issued a political manifesto attacking the family's position on the Soviet Union. She said, "Go to sleep for God's sakes, you damn fool, you and your communist ideas. We saw them already, Papa and me. In 1905, we guessed it, all." At the door of the kitchen, she said, "You never finish your lunch. You run around senselessly. What will become of you?" Then she died. Naturally, for the rest of my life, I have longed to see her, not only in doorways, in a great number of places. In the dining room with my aunts. In the window looking up and down the block. In the country garden among zinnias and marigolds. In the living room with my father. They sat in comfortable leather chairs. They were listening to Mozart. They looked at one another amazed. It seemed to them they had just come over on the boat. They had just learned the first English words. It seemed to them that he had just proudly handed in a 100% correct exam to the American anatomy professor. It seemed as though she had just quit the shop for the kitchen. I wish I could see her in the doorway of the living room. She stood there a minute. Then she sat beside him. They owned an expensive record player. They were listening to Bach. She said to him, "Talk to me a little. We don't talk so much anymore." "I'm tired," he said. "Can't you see? I saw maybe 30 patients today, all sick, all talk, 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 talk." "Listen to the music," he said. "I believe you once had perfect pitch." "I'm tired," he said. Then she died. This story is called The Immigrant Story. Jack asked me, "Isn't it a terrible thing to grow up in the shadow of another person's sorrow?" "I suppose so," I answered. "As you know, I grew up in the summer sunlight of upward mobility. This leached out a lot of the dark ancestral grief." He went on with his life. "It's not your fault, if that's the case. Your bad disposition is not your fault. Yet you're always angry. No way out but continuous rage or the nut house." "Well, what if this sorrow is all due to history?" I asked. "Oh, yeah, the cruel history of Europe," he said. In this way he showed ironic respect to one of my known themes. "The whole world ought to be opposed to Europe for its cruel history, Jack, and yet in favor of it because after about 1,000 years it may have learned some sense." "Nonsense," he said objectively. 1,000 years of outgoing, persistent imperial cruelty tends to make enemies. And if all you have to deal with these enemies is good sense, what then?" "My dear, no one knows the power of good sense. It hasn't been built up or experimented with sufficiently." "I'm trying to tell you something," he said. "Listen, one day I woke up and my father was asleep in the crib." "I wonder why," I said. "My mother made him sleep in the crib." "All the time?" "That time anyway, that time I saw him." "I wonder why," I said. "Because she didn't want him to fuck her," he said. "No, I don't believe that. Who told you that?" "I know it." He pointed his finger at me. "I don't believe it," I said. "Unless she's had 5 babies all in a row and they have to get up at 6 a.m. or they hate each other. Most people like their husbands to do that." "Bullshit. She was trying to make him feel guilty. Where were his balls?" Now, I will never respond to that question. Asked in a worried way again and again, it may become responsible for the destruction of the entire world. I gave it 2 minutes of silence. He said, "Misery, misery, misery, grayness. I see it all very gray." My mother approaches the crib. "Shmuel," she says, "get up, run down to the corner, get me 1/2 pound of pot cheese. Then run over to the drugstore, get a few ounces cod liver oil." My father, scrunched like an old gray fetus, looks up and smiles, smiles, smiles at the bitch. "How do you know what was going on?" I asked. "You were 5 years old." "Well, what do you think was going on?" "I'll tell you, it's not so hard. Any dope who's had a normal life could tell you. Anyone whose head has not been fermenting with the compost of 10 years of gluttonous analysis, anyone could tell you." "Tell me what?" he screamed. "The reason your father was sleeping in the crib was you and your sister, who usually slept in the crib, had scarlet fever and needed the decent beds and more room to sweat, come to a fever crisis and either get well or die." "Who told you that?" He lunged at me as though I was an enemy. "You fucking enemy," he said. "You always see things in a rosy light. You have a rotten, rosy temperament. You were like that in 6th grade. One day you brought 3 American flags to school." That was true. I made an announcement to the 6th grade assembly 30 years ago. I said, "I thank God every day that I am not in Europe. I thank God I'm American-born and live on East 172nd Street, where there is a grocery store, a candy store, and a drugstore on one corner, and on the same block, a show and 2 doctor's offices. 172nd Street was a pile of shit, he said. Everyone was on welfare except you. 30 people had TB. Citizens and non-citizens alike starving until the war. Thank God capitalism has a war it can pull out of the old feed bag every now and then. Or we'd all be dead. Ha, ha, ha. Well, I'm glad you're not totally brainwashed by stocks, bonds, and cash, I said. I'm glad to hear you still mention capitalism from time to time. Because of poverty brilliance and the early appearance of lots of soft hair on face and crotch, my friend Jack was a noticeable Marxist and Freudian by the morning of his 12th birthday. In fact, his mind thickened with ideas. I continued to put out more flags. There were 28 flags aflutter in different rooms and windows. I had one tattooed onto my arm. It has gotten dimmer, but a lot wider because of middle age. Well, I'm probably more radical than you are nowadays, I said to him. Since I was not wiped out of my professions during the McCarthy Inquisition, I did not have to go into business for myself and make a fortune. You damn fool. Plenty wiped out to this day. I mean, brilliant guys, engineers, teachers, broken, just broken. Well, I said, I believe I see the world as clearly as you do. Rosiness is not a worse window pane than gloomy gray when viewing the world. Yes, he said. Do you mind? But just listen. My mother and father came from a small town in Poland. They had 3 sons. My father decided to go to America, to stay out of the army, to stay out of jail, to save his children from everyday war and ordinary pogroms. He was helped by the savings of parents, uncles, grandmothers, and set off, like hundreds of thousands of others in that year. In America, New York City, he lived a hard but hopeful life. Sometimes he walked on Delancey Street. Sometimes, like a bachelor, he went to the theater on 2nd Avenue. Mostly he put his money away for the day he could bring his wife and sons to this place. Meanwhile, in Poland, famine struck. Not hunger, which all Americans suffer 6-7 times a day, but famine, which tells the body to consume itself. First the fat, then the meat, then the muscle, then the blood. Famine ate up the bodies of the little boys pretty quickly. My father met my mother at the boat. He looked at her face, her hands, no baby in her arms, no children dragging at her skirt. She was not wearing her hair in 2 long black braids. There was a kerchief over a dark, wiry wig. She had shaved her head like a backward Orthodox bride, though they had been serious advanced socialists like most of the youth of their town. He took her by the hand and brought her home. They never went anywhere alone, except to work or the grocer's. They held each other's hand when they sat down at the table, even at breakfast. Sometimes he patted her hand, sometimes she patted his. He read the paper to her every night. They are sitting at the edge of their chairs. He's leaning forward, reading to her in that old bulb light. Sometimes she smiles, just a little. Then he puts the paper down and takes both her hands in his as though they needed warmth. He continues to read. Just beyond the table and their heads, there is the darkness of the kitchen, the bedroom, the dining room, the shadowy darkness where as a child I ate my supper, did my homework, and went to bed. I'm going to read some poems now, and then I'll read another story probably. This is a sort of story poem. I've been doing some of these, and I'm not sure whether they're stories or poems. But I met a woman on the plane. I liked her. She came from somewhere around Tampa. She was going to Chicago. She'd had 5 children. No, she'd had 6. One died at 23 days. People said at least you didn't get too attached. She had married at 16. She married again 20 years later. She said she loved her first husband, couldn't manage life though. 5 small children, I said. No, not that. What, him? No, me. I couldn't get over that baby girl. Everyone else did. Him, the big kids. You're driving us all crazy, they said. But that baby, you can't believe her beautifulness. When I came into the kid's room, in her little crib, not a month old, no breath, no breathing. They say get over it. It's more than 10 years. Go away. Leave us for a while. So I did that. And here I am, she said. I have a cousin in Chicago. Where are you going? Now these are a couple of poems. This is a bunch of Proverbs. That means you're supposed to take it very seriously. Proverbs. A person's anger should be respected, even when it isn't shared. A person's happiness should be shared, even if it isn't understood. A person should be understood, though he has brought both his brows together in anger and suddenly begun to laugh. A person should be in love most of the time. This is the last proverb and may be learned by all the organs capable of bodily response. On occasion, I forget the names of my friends and the names of my flowers in my garden. My friends remind me, Grace, it's us. The flowers just stand there, stunned by the midsummer day. A long time ago, my mother said, darling, there are also wildflowers, but look, these I planted. My flowers are pink and rose and orange. They're sturdy. They make new petals every day to fill in their fat brown faces. Suddenly, before thought, I called out, Zinnia! 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 Along came a sunny summer breeze. They swayed, lightly bowed. So I said, Mother. This is an anti-love poem. I think I have a love poem that somebody wanted me to read. I'm looking for it, but I haven't found it yet. But so I'll start with an anti-love poem. Sometimes you don't want to love the person you love. You turn your face away from that face, whose eyes, lips might make you give up anger, forget insult, steal sadness of not wanting to love. Turn away then, turn away. At breakfast, in the evening, don't lift your eyes from the paper to see that face in all its seriousness, a sweetness of concentration. He holds his book in his hand, the hard-knuckled, winter wood-scarred fingers. Turn away, that's all you can do, old as you are, to save yourself from love. This is a poem I wrote for my friend. I've been writing a lot of poems for her lately. This one is called Our Diseases, sort of about my generation. It's my lungs, Catherine says. He smoked, in bed for years, till Women's Lib came along, said he couldn't do it anymore. It was too late for me, the bastard. He killed me. Then there was Joan, and she whispered Parkinson's. Me too, Ellie said. Me too. But they were okay. Used walkers. Couldn't type, though. Hard for old writers. Couple of tough double pneumonias, long recoveries. Well, we have one another. Now and then, a peculiar illness crops up. We run like real Americans to computers and know the diagnosis before the doctor. My own illness was headlined in the Times. For some reason, I was proud. The last time my name appeared in the paper, it was with a friend years and years ago in jail during the Vietnam War, and I was only middle-aged. This one is called Translation. To translate a poem from thinking into English takes all nights and days. English does the best it can, while the mother's tongue, Russian, omits the verb to be again and again, and is always interfering with the excited, industrious brain. Wisely, the heart's beat asserts control. Also, the newest English argues with its old singing ancestry. It thinks it knows best. Finally, the night's hard labor peers through the morning window, observes birds, snow, the sun, caught in the white and black winter birch, disentangles itself, and works for hours at greening the ice-cold meadow. This one is called Fathers. Fathers are more fathering these days. They have accomplished this by becoming more mothering. What luck for them that women's lib happened. Then the dream of new fathering began to shine in the eyes of free women and was irresistible. On the New York subways and the mass transits of other cities, one may see fatherings of many colors with their round babies on their laps. This may also happen in the countryside. These scenes were brand new, exciting for an old woman who had watched the old fathers gathering once again in familiar army camps and comfortable war rooms to consider the necessary eradication of the new fathering fathers who are their sons, as well as the women and children who will surely be in the way. I don't know if people will get this poem. It's kind of peculiar, but it may be a local Bronx poem. I'm not sure, but let's see. I was sorry. Some of you will get what's happening as far as food is concerned. I was sorry for sour cream. Yogurt had gotten so popular. But that's where assimilation leads, my Zionist aunt said to my mother, and consider there are worse capitulations. Our history, for instance, that took all our children out of the Bronx and delivered them by sea train to Lower Bohemia, the village awash in spaghetti, which entangled our homemade noodles and drowned them in tomato sauce. Well, sentiment gets you nowhere. I was invited to write an occasional poem, a couple of occasional poems, which I never had done before. But this was sort of, I live in Vermont, in the town, and the firemen have a big party and stuff, and then they want you to write a poem for them, or it's a Thanksgiving, then there's an interfaith Thanksgiving gathering, and so on. So this is what happened when I did it. I'm not exactly certain. But we'll try it, right? I mean, you're sitting there and I'm standing here, so. Okay. Anyone who gets to be 80 years old, I wrote this 3 years ago, so I'm older now. Anyone who gets to be 80 years old says thank you to the one in charge, then immediately begins to complain. Why were those years such a historical mess? Why was my happiness and willing gratitude interfered with every single decade? No sooner were the normal wars with parents, lovers, children ended than the interfering greed of total strangers, probably 80 years old as well, and full of their own bloated thankfulness at unbelievable success in the expropriation of what belonged to other people, not to mention the economic degradation leading to thanks engendering profits in our own country and in the innocent or colluding parts of the world. I am sadly reminded of the first couple of our American Thanksgivings. Thank you, thank you, thank you, our first Americans, together with the absolutely first Americans, called Indians by mistake. Within a generation or half of one, the first Americans proceeded to drive the absolutely first Americans from their villages, rivers, fields, over mountains, and across the continent. Out, out, they cried, almost at the same time, shouting, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." I don't know about this. Well, I'll try. You can't think without thinking about something. My friends who are Buddhists are sometimes thinking weeks on end about how to think about nothing. They are often successful. Sometimes, looking at that famous sculpture or a picture of it, I think, oh, he is surely not thinking about anything. He only wants to give the appearance to passers-by for some reason, or he needs to hold his heavy head in his hands, which will allow thoughts or ideas into his stoniness, just as I, putting my pen to paper, am pretty sure that something which has pressed upon my breath beyond bearing will appear in words, take form and singing, and let me go on with my life. When she came to meet him at the ferry, he said, "You are so pale, worn, so frail." Standing on her toes to reach his ear, she whispered, "I am an old woman." Oh, then he was always kind. I said, I didn't want my friends to be pink like me. I wanted them to be brown. Brown, brown. Apart from beauty, which can be found anywhere, it seemed to be a healthy color, could deal with sun and wind in a biologically intelligent way, could be worn with the finest yellows, oranges, black, even matching browns, lovely in any crowd. Also oppressed. Sufferers, even after happy childhoods, anxiety and anger. Like people in my family among insane Europeans, strangers despised, even after 1,000 years. Surprised my dark friends didn't know this. America. America. I mean the United States of. One day in the subway I saw seated side by side, for some reason appearing shy, a woman and man so black the true blueness of blood flashed in their broad cheeks. There they sat, watching across the aisle, the different New York light to darkest browns, the brutal, whitening centuries, the kind that gave my people occasional blue eyes, yellow hair, the whitening job. My friend listened. What are you talking about? Are you blind? All that fuss, all that fucking, and the world is browner. How come you don't see? The world just struggling out of dead white through cafe au lait on the way back to chocolate, warmer every day. What a terrible racket they made beating all those swords into plowshares. People were deafened worldwide. Letters of protest as well as serious essays pointing out in the sensible way of ordinary people we no longer use plowshares. Swords have been for generations the playthings of boys and men. Now the government that year happened to be a poet. It explained in a kindly way, citizens, we had in mind a living, performing metaphor, using familiar religious themes and literary memories. Of course, once we get those useless plowshares, there may be a couple of economic or industrial uses. We will even be able to beat them back into swords, should swords still be required by boys and men. That's we're lucky to have so much paper in our world. There are whole worlds where there is not this much paper. I'll read you this. This is where I live now and what much of my life is like. A walk in March. It's actually a walk in early April, but that's the way it is. This hill, crossed with broken pines and maples, lumpy with the burial mounds of uprooted hemlocks, hurricane of 38. Out of their rotting hearts, generations rise, trying once more to become the forest. Just beyond them, tall enough to be called trees, in their youth, like aspen, a bouquet of young beech is gathered. They still wear last summer's leaves, the lightest brown, almost translucent. How their stubbornness has decorated the winter woods. On this narrow path, ice tries to keep the black, undecaying oak leaves in its crackling grip. It's become too hard to walk. At last, a sunny patch. Oh, I'm in water to my ankles. April. I'll just read a couple more things, especially if I find them. Okay. Okay. I think some people may not like the end of this story, but there's a lot of truth in it. I've received it's called Words. It's really sort of an essay, but it's only 3/4 of a page. So when you hear the word essay, you could get nervous. But if I tell you it's only 3/4 of a page, your heart's at rest at once. Words. I have received a couple of letters from people who need articles for their magazines or additions to anthologies. These letter writers, one was an organization, reminded me that I was now an older person, and what did I think I was leaving to the next generation? They explained that the world was in worse shape than it was when I was an energetic, middle-aged person. What would be my, if I were, would I have left? If I were a man, it would be called patrimony. So I came to these two interesting words, patrimony and matrimony, and they do not say what they mean. Patriarchy and matriarchy do. Patrimony, as any reader probably knows, is what you inherit from your father. Matrimony is the state of being in a marriage. Now, men live in it, marriage, as well as women, and it is therefore a little joke for men that this word is used about a condition in which women and families have often suffered the strongest patriarchal oppression. Matrimony is not what you inherit from your mother, probably because in history she didn't own much of anything. This was true at least for 500 years ago, sounding a little more French. It was true in England 500 years ago. The words patrimony and matrimony have that same meaning today. So you see, it's been a long time. We could say that matrimony or marriage is woman's inheritance. There are probably other words that disregard their etymological history in order to be transformed into the gender-ridden history of men and women. If marriage and its historic condition has been what women leave to their daughters and sons, what is it that men leave, having left and continue to leave? War, of course, to their sons, its excitement, creativity, mutilation, and death. To their daughters, rape, torture, widowhood, famine, death. Well, that should have cheered you up. What if this week? What if this century doesn't end? What if the Serbs continue their snarling, self-loving wrath, and the Kosovars their hopeless arming, and the Hutus their vengeful, slaughtering rage, and the American-armed mullahs of Afghanistan their devout exclusion of the joyful life of women, and the landowners of the world their terrible return again and again to what is unrightfully theirs, and the darker people burning with insult and pride of population, and the Americans their deliberate impoverishment of Vietnam in order to win the lost war, and the Russians continue their hard job of giving up old badness just to be bad like everyone else, and the Irish unstrung on the lyres of history, and the Somalis clanned and unclanned, and the Turks their habitual attacks on the Kurds, and the Iraqis their habitual attacks on the Kurds. What if my friend never stopped saying, if I had 6 sons, I'd give them all? What if I scream horror, and she explains to me the idealistic politics of sacrificing sons? What if the 36 just men and women who repair the world year after year fill their frailty and petition that one to increase their number? What if there is no answer from time creating heaven, no sound, no interest, not a turning away, suddenly absence? What if there is no child, male or female, white or black, no mother, no child? I'm going to read 2 little short pieces. This one is called The Plot on the Poem. Somebody said to me that I don't write, that I have no plot when I write. And I don't know why I got offended. What do I care if I have a plot or not, you know? But it's when somebody says things like that to you, you think, you forget the reality that you really don't care. So you try to defend yourself. So I said, well, I don't know. And then I wrote this piece called A Plot and a Poem. The man sat beside my aunt. The first part is the plot. Well, you'll notice that because it has a plot, right? The man sat beside my aunt on the Brighton Beach boardwalk bench. He looked at her. He fell in love with her immediately. This was because of her beauty and shy, middle-aged friendliness. He had been a widower for many years. They had tea in a shop under the Brighton Beach L 3 or 4 times. Then we said we would like to meet him. Well, we all agreed, a kind and thoughtful man, thank God. Come for a real supper next week, we said. Then he invited her to meet his family, his daughters and his sons, 2 of each. Unfortunately, he was rich. They often thought of that fact. They said she was not their kind. My aunt and the men had tea once more. He said, well, what can I do? They're my children. My aunt sadly said, you see, that shows what a good man he is. Years earlier, in another country, Russia, when she was about 16, she had expected happiness. It was a boy, 18, as boys often are. This expectation coincided with a rage of pogroms, that is, the decisions of many Russians to kill many Jews. To save themselves, her mother and brother and sister sailed to the great city, New York. In this way, my aunt missed the First World War, the Russian Revolution, more pogroms, the Second World War, the Holocaust, as well as the consummation of that always remembered love that she had thought would be her life. She lived the next 50 years in our family house with her mother, her sister, and my mother, who was her enemy, she thought, and with a child, me, who loved her but could not be her life. She often thought, she believed, that my father, her brother, could be her life, but he was already the life of too many people. The poem. My Aunt Mira said to me, Gracie, my darling, I am lonely for my life. It is still somewhere, I know it, but it has outlived me. I'll read a couple more poems. This one for my mother. My mother, because I don't write many poems for you, doesn't mean I haven't thought about you every single day of these last 50 years. What an avalanche of time. I can't begin to tell you. It's true, though. In 1 or 2 busy decades, when the children were young and noisy, when the war and intense sexual love interfered, it's possible I thought of you, my mother, less often. Even then, suddenly, in the evening, I might see you, for a moment, standing beside my father under the Norway maple. Your hair is at last cut short and is becoming to your broad Slavic face. Your hands are clasped lightly over the belly of a summer dress. Your arms merely hide the fact that you have only one breast. I watch my sister snap that picture. My mother, I have not needed to hold it in my hand. And I'll end with these two poems. Here I am in the garden laughing, an old woman with heavy breasts and a nice mapped face. How did this happen? Well, that's who I wanted to be. At last, a woman in the old style, sitting, stout thighs apart, under a big skirt, grandchild sliding on, off my lap, a pleasant summer perspiration. That's my old man across the yard. He's talking to the meter reader. He's telling him the world's sad story, how electricity is oil or uranium, and so forth. I tell my grandson, run over to your grandpa, ask him to sit beside me for a minute. I am suddenly exhausted by my desire to kiss his sweet, explaining lips. In this poem, Walking in the Woods. That's when I saw the old maple, a couple of its thick arms cracked, one arm reclining half-rotted into earth, black with the delicious hospitality of rot to the littlest creatures. The tree not really dying, living less widely, green head high above the other leaf-crowded trees, a terrible stretch to sun, just to stay alive. But if you liked life, you do it. Thank you.